Good morning, children. Yesterday we had seen, or rather, we had started the topic of gender literacy and culture, and we had seen how important women were in the Roman society, and the rights that they have and the rights that they enjoyed. Certain rights are not enjoyed by women in many parts of the world even today, and that is what we had seen, and also the fact that women could participate in not many activities within the Roman society. So Romans in general were far more kind of uh, they were far more receptive to women playing important roles within the society. Now today we talk about the literacy part of it. So what about literacy? That is what it says here. What about literacy? It is certain that rates of casual literacy varied greatly between different parts of empire. For example, in Pompeii, which was buried in volcanic eruption in 79 AD, there is a strong evidence of widespread casual literacy. Uh, Walls in the main streets of Pompeii often carried advertisements, and graffiti were found all over the city. Now, students, Pompeii, though it has been mentioned here for in reference to the education and the literacy, but let me tell you that Pompeii is very famous in history for an entirely different reason, and it had nothing to do with literacy. Um, Students, this in 79 AD, that is as it is mentioned here, that Pompeii, today anyone, if you mention Pompeii, people would say that yes, the place where that massive Mount Vesuvius exploded. Now, Mount Vesuvius was a volcano, and a volcano which had been lying dormant and which had been lying inactive for many, many years. And people had literally forgotten about it, though it was massive in size and always presided over the whole area. And you could see Mount Vesuvius from a great distance. And yet, no one thought that, yes, it could be threatening as well. But in 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius exploded. It's still considered to be, though it happened almost like 2000 years ago, it is still considered to be one of the deadliest volcanic eruptions to have ever happened on the planet, and definitely the worst in Europe till now. You just get an idea as to how lethal and how powerful it was. That even today it is considered to be far more, far more powerful in its blast value compared to the atom bombs which were used during Second World War against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. So the explosion was far more powerful than those atomic explosions which had happened in 1945. So you can imagine how devastating the explosion was. And Pompeii and there were there were, along with Pompeii, there was this settlement of Herculaneum, and then I remember Oplontis. Yes, these are the places which were completely buried under the ash of volcanic ash, and thousands of people perished. So Pompeii is more known for these casualties and the devastation of Mount Vesuvius rather than the literacy. But that's yes, that's another point. That's something else. By contrast, in Egypt, where hundreds of papyri survive, most formal documents, such as contracts, were usually written by professional scribes, and they often tell us that X or Y is unable to read and write. But even here, literacy was certainly more widespread among certain categories, such as soldiers, army officers, and estate managers. So essentially, what this paragraph is trying to kind of, to say is, and a bit of in a humorous kind of fashion, that though Egypt used to be one of the largest sources of writing material, but very few Egyptians could read or write. That's in simple terms, that's what it means. Now, the cultural diversity of the empire was reflected in many ways and at many levels. In the vast diversity of religious cults and local deities, the plurality of languages that were spoken, the styles of dress, the costume, what people ate, their form of social organization, that's tribal, non tribal, even their patterns of settlement. Aramaic was the dominant language group of the Near East, and as um, I don't know if I told you, students, that Aramaic happens to be one of the very ancient languages of the world, and Aramaic is still spoken in many parts of the Middle Eastern areas. And Aramaic was the language which was very famously spoken by Jesus Christ, because, yes, and that's why this language refuses to die, because a lot of religious texts are still kind of written using this language. Now, Coptic was spoken in Egypt, Punic and Berber in North Africa, Celtic in Spain and the Northwest. But many of these linguistic cultures were purely oral, at least until a script was invented for them. Armenian, for example, only began to be written as late as 5th century, whereas there was already a Coptic translation of the Bible. Now, students, this is what essentially what they're trying to again say, which was very prevalent which was very rather common to all the cultures, ancient cultures at that point in time, whereby if the written script had not been discovered or invented by a certain section of civilization, or certain societies, it did not naturally and automatically mean that they were illiterates. You also have to understand that in the earlier times, the tradition of knowledge and the tradition of imparting knowledge, the tradition of sharing and transfer of knowledge was mostly vocal, was mostly verbal. They were not written, and the similar was the condition in India, where we happen to be very, very ancient, but the mode of learning was always by memorizing the texts, by memorizing what the guru was saying, by memorizing everything. It was not written. Okay, so people started writing even in India just about 700, 800 years before the before the birth of Christ. So the 700 AD, 700 BC or 800 BC, when we actually started writing all that stuff. Otherwise, till then, in fact, Mahabharata and Ramayana, which when the events took place many centuries before the birth of Christ, but then it always went on through verbal traditions. Got transferred from one family to the other through verbal traditions, and it was only in 400, 500, 600 BC that these great monuments of learning were actually documented and written. Otherwise they had always been through the verbal traditions. And the same thing is being talked about the Armenian language, which again happens to be Strins Armenia is in Asia, and it's very close to Turkey. Now, what they are trying to say is this area again, which happens to be having very ancient roots, but it was only around 500 AD, that is after death of Christ, 500 years after Christ, that they actually started coming with their own script. Such an ancient civilization that did not have that tradition of writing and coming up with a script. So this is what we are dealing with here. Economic expansion. The empire had a substantial economic infrastructure of harbors, mines, quarries, brickyards, olive oil factories, etc. Wheat, wine, and olive oil were traded and consumed in huge quantities, and they came mainly from Spain, the Gallic provinces, North Africa. The Gallic provinces would mean students, the areas around France, present day France, Egypt, and to a lesser extent Italy, where the conditions were best for these crops. Liquids like wine and olive oil were transported in containers called amphorae. Okay, the fragments and shreds of a very wide number of these survive, and it has been possible for archaeologists to reconstruct the precise shape of these containers. So essentially, what they are trying to say is, not something which you would not know. That if an empire is flourishing, and if an empire is an urban empire and it is flourishing, and people are affluent, people are rich, the standard of living is high, naturally it all this is built on trade, right? Because any empire or civilization or society for that matter, which languishes in trade, internal or external for that matter, it is extremely rare and almost rather not possible for it to be a prosperous one, because if you don't trade, where do you get the money from? There has to be an exchange of goods and services. So whether in those years, whether it was through barter or when the currency came into circulation, but ultimately it has to be trade, and that's what's being said here. The Spanish olive oil of this period was mainly carried in a container called wrestle. Guys, this is something which you can read on your own, nothing to be explained here, that is more to be read here. Okay, and so we go there is. Yes, the success of Spanish olive growers was then repeated by North African producers, because students, it is obvious that because North Africa and the southern part of Europe, both of them are divided and separated by the Mediterranean, large Mediterranean Sea that comes in between. And so naturally, both these areas have the Mediterranean climate. So the climate is the same, more or less similar soil conditions, and the similar weather patterns. So naturally, the crops that they used to grow was also common. So later, after 425 AD, North African dominance was broken by the East in the latter 5th and 6th centuries of the Aegean, Southern Asia Minor, Turkey. Syria and Palestine became major exporters of wine and olive oil, and containers from Africa showed dramatically reduced presence on the Mediterranean markets. Besides these broad movements, um, the prosperity of individual regions rose and fell depending on how effectively they could organize the production and transport of particular goods, and on the quality of these goods. So, students, what essentially is being said is that, like it happens in any society or civilization, certain areas rise in prominence, and then the same areas, after a certain point in time, they fall in prominence and then they rise again. So, here, that is what it was, that Northern Africa, which enjoyed a quite prolonged reign of prosperity, ultimately found that yes, a great part of the trading was shifting to now the Asian, but that is the West Asia, the areas around today's Syria, Palestine, Israel, that is current Israel, and areas around Asian. Now, students, Asians, what is Asian? It essentially is, if you look at the world map, Asian, there's nothing called a large landmass called Asian. Uh, Asian is a sea. Okay, it is a sea. If you actually look at the global map, it is a sea, an Aegean Sea. Now, that is a sea which lies between, and there are hundreds of islands on that in that Aegean Sea, and that is the sea which separates Greece from Turkey. Okay, and we are talking about all that farming in those islands, because and trading, because you have to understand hundreds of ships work, because there were hundreds of islands there, so a lot of ships were crisscrossing those areas all the time, and uh, that is what it was about, that the whole trading gradually the trading activity started shifting. But this is something which happens all the time in all parts of the world. Okay, some area rises in prominence, some area falls in prominence, so that's how it is. Tomorrow we shall continue.